Off you go, Harry.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, sorry, what time is it? Sorry, I'm late. What kind of person leaves exactly 20 minutes to complete a 23-minute walk from the hotel to their talk? Somebody who hasn't read their own guidelines on how to give a good talk, I think. So this talk is about arguments, not function arguments, but actual arguments between programmers. I'd like to start with a little story. This is my godfather, Bob Beckman, rest in peace. You can see he was quite a character. And one of the features of this presentation, by the way, is going to be highly pixelated images because the hotel Wi-Fi wasn't really letting me get past the preview stage of Google image search. So. But anyway, this is one of the only surviving pictures of Bob Beckman on the internet. He wrote a book, and he said, when I went to university, I studied economics and philosophy, and I went into computers. And he says, I was always very surprised, Harry, that you went into that, because I was convinced that you were going to be a lawyer. Because from the earliest age, you would argue and contradict everyone incessantly. So I think that in programming we have sort of unproductive arguments. But I think to a certain extent that might just be me having unproductive arguments. So I observe a lot of unproductive arguments because I'm having them. This talk may be a little bit of a sort of self-diagnosis and a journey of self-discovery, and I'm having it in a sort of narcissistic way in front of a lot of you. So be warned that not everything here may be relevant, but I think maybe that unproductive arguments in programming are a wider trend, and so I hope to share a few things with you. But definitely the way my mind works, and I don't know about you, this really is a pathology, but as soon as I hear anything, there's a part of me, like any statement of any kind, there's a part of my brain that's immediately finding out what the opposite of that is and trying to figure out ways in which that might not be true. So it's a famous sort of elderly rabbis arguing technique who, when confronted with something they don't like, oh, rabbi, something, 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 they will say, well, actually, the opposite is true. And they will continue to take that sort of an argumentative style forwards. And I think that my brain does that automatically. So some of this may be just brain damage of some kind. But I find myself kind of thinking of contradictions and having that sort of discussion with people, whether it's out loud or not. But I wasn't a programmer straight away. I studied economics, not law, and I went off to the field of consulting. So management consultancy involves a lot of discussions, and I found myself in a lot of arguments in management consulting, and they weren't very productive. And so two things came out of that. First of all, I found that there was a lot of arguments and discussions about what to do, and they were very seldom based on any kind of facts. And decisions were very seldom made on sort of rational basis. There was just usually political considerations, and facts didn't really enter into it. And another thing that there was in consulting is when I would sort of have a lively discussion with one of our clients, because I was pretty clear that they were doing things all wrong, and I was going to explain to them how to do it right. And my colleagues would say, well, that's all very well, Harry, and you probably are right, but nobody wants to hear that. What you have to do, you must have an argument with someone. You have to ask them a series of leading questions, which are going to allow them step by step to realize the answer kind of on their own, but with your guidance. And I never learned that skill, and I thought it was all nonsense. And sure enough, when I arrived at Resolver Systems, my first programming employer, I was overjoyed to find that we would have arguments, but all of a sudden, facts actually mattered, which was joyful. I suddenly found myself in an environment where we were making decisions based on logic and facts, or so it seemed, or very much more than in my previous career. And I was like, hooray, well, I'm glad I didn't learn all of those soft influencing and persuasion skills, since they're only necessary for irrational people who make decisions on irrational bases. And here I am finally in my sort of true programming community where we only make entirely rational, sane decisions based on logic. Something to which I'm sure you can all relate. So, how many times have you ever been in an argument with someone, whether it's in real life or maybe on the internet, where you're discussing something where there is a sort of logical, rational basis to the discussion, and you're going to construct a sane, rational argument, you're going to present a series of facts and evidence to support your claim, and the other person on the internet goes, goodness me, why, thank you so much. I am now persuaded, and I'm glad that you've been able to achieve this for me and help me to come round to your point of view. Thank you. Hands up if that's ever happened to you. So it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in consulting. It doesn't happen on the internet. It doesn't happen in programming. We have these arguments. They go around in circles, and we don't seem to be able to use rational basis to make decisions. And as someone in the Python fighting community often says, there must be a better way. So this presentation today is me sort of on my own little journey of trying to find a better way of doing arguments. It's going to involve a little bit of introspection about why I argue, maybe why we argue, hopefully. And then a few techniques that I've discovered on ways that I can try and be better about having discussions. So, I have to warn you that some fairly wishy-washy pop psychology may be about to happen, something that we're not always very comfortable with in programming, either A, because we don't really like discussing our feelings, which is one of the problems with us and why we argue, or B, because it is all nonsense, or perhaps a combination of the two. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is that DjangoCon Europe earlier this year, is anyone there? They were offering a free counseling service, so, which is an amazing thing. I think all conferences should do this. Mental health issues are a big problem in our industry. I thankfully am relatively free of them. There's always room for improvement. So I thought I'd pick up one of the free little vouchers that allowed you a half-an-hour slot with a counselor. I've never spoken to a counselor before, but I figured it's free. There's a couple of things on my mind. I'll talk to them. And this is a great idea in general. People who might be uncomfortable with going to go and seek some sort of help for a mental health issue, they're not going to be comfortable necessarily. If they're not comfortable yet doing that in their regular lives, you know, alongside their job and their family and whatever, you take people out of their ordinary context, away from home, in a place where they're surrounded not by their own colleagues and family. Maybe that's a good time to have an intervention. So free counseling at programming conferences, great idea. And so I went in and I said, one of the things I talked about is I said, hey, gosh, I'm really argumentative. I'm argumentative with my friends and my colleagues and my wife. I wish I could tone it down. And the counselor said to me, why do you think it's so important to you to be right? And I went, I don't know. And she said, well, look, listen, sometimes at school, particularly if you've been to boarding school, if you're ever wrong, that's like a little chink in your armor that bullies can get into. And so sometimes, like from early childhood, you can get quite attached to this idea of making sure that you're always right and correct. So I don't know, I wonder if I can ask for a show of hands here, and obviously if you're uncomfortable with this, you shouldn't do it, like outing yourself as a person who went to boarding school is a bit of a thing. But if you went to boarding school, would you put up your hands if you feel comfortable with it? If you went to boarding school starting below the age of 10, would you keep your hands up? Okay, so I've read a book about this since. That's an extraordinary thing to do to a child, to separate them from their family, and put them in a sort of environment away from sort of family love, and say, okay, now you have to kind of pretend to be an adult, and we're going to go and do learning all the time. And so boarding school might be an extreme example, but I think everyone has this thing where if you're surrounded by a maybe slightly scary situation, a school situation away from home, you're going to not want to show too many chinks in your armor. Particularly maybe if you're a bit of a stereotypical nerd, and I don't want to reinforce this stereotype, but if maybe you're not that good at sport and you're not too popular, so where does your self-worth come from? It might come from being good at your studies and being right about stuff. And you might start to attach this idea of like being right is important to me. It's one of the ways that I define myself and that I succeed in life. And the other part is if you want to try and distance yourself from your vulnerabilities, you want to say, okay, well, I'm the kind of person who is right, and I'm not wrong, and I don't miss my mum and dad, and I don't have imposter syndrome, then we do a thing called dissociation where we deny that those parts of us exist. And that's got to come out somewhere, and sometimes you're going to go and project that onto people around you. So if you've got an insecurity that says, well, what if I'm not right all the time, and you can find somebody else, and you can say, wait, they're definitely wrong, that means I'm right. So good, the part of me that I'm worried that is maybe not always right about stuff, actually that's out over there. Good, not part of me. So this idea of dissociation may be one of the reasons that we seek to sort of confirm that we are right and stable and comfortable. Certainly that might be my problem. So this is a thing that might happen at boarding schools. It might happen in all kinds of schools. Boarding schools are a very male-dominated field. Anybody recognize this illustration? Perhaps the argumentative culture, the culture that doesn't want to show vulnerability, the culture that doesn't want to allow for the fact that they might not already have all the answers or be wrong or not demonstrating full control all the time, maybe a male-dominated culture is going to tend to exaggerate that. That does not mean that all men are that way. It just means that a male-dominated culture is going to tend to suppress the other aspects of the ways that we might want to be in the world. And so I think maybe that's something that happens in programming. You know, any instinct like that is going to get reinforced by being surrounded by that kind of discourse. But all is not lost. One of the great things about the programming culture and the Python culture, which I've really enjoyed, is that we actually have a word for this sort of thing. We talk about bike shedding. So please put your hands up if you don't know what bike shedding is. Oh my God. Right, fantastic, good, useful story. So bike shedding is an apocryphal tale about a local council committee who are asked to review the plans for a nuclear power plant, which they have to approve for their sort of local area. Now, the local town council planning committee don't know much about nuclear engineering. So they have a 6-hour meeting in which they spend all of their time arguing about the color of the bike sheds. Because nobody really feels competent to talk about anything else, but everyone does want to hear the sound of their own voice, and they do feel competent arguing about the color of bike sheds. And so this is something that we find a lot in programming, is we use the word bike shedding to describe some time when a discussion about programming has got sidetracked into a long argument over something fairly irrelevant and trivial, within which it's an entirely subjective opinion as to whether there's a right and wrong. And so it'll be great if you're on Python mailing lists in the Python community, you'll eventually see someone saying, all right, let's stop bike shedding, or maybe let the bike shedding begin, and we can all enjoy having a pointless discussion about whether the website should have a white background or a black background or whatever else it may be. So we are kind of aware of this, and the Python community is wonderful and supportive, and we work in the world of open source, which is a world that sort of which is forces collaboration on you. It forces you to say, well, if you've got your project and you've started it and you want to enlist help in it, you know, you can't just argue with everyone because no one will help you. And you do sort of need to kind of present yourself in a way that's going to be constructive. So we're a little bit aware of this. I think there is light at the end of the tunnel. But not only light. Who here reads existential comics? Comic I recommend to everyone. This is The Adventures of Fallacy Man, who spots a little discussion going on. Spots that someone is committing a logical fallacy and gives them a good kick in the chest. But soon Fallacy Man's arch nemesis arrives. I'm not sure if you can read that, but Fallacy Man is there saying, "Guy, everywhere I go, it seems that I encounter people making fallacies, and sometimes he gets a sudden blast in the chest from Cognitive Bias Boy, saying, that's confirmation bias." So the problem is we'd like to have nice, rational, sane arguments, but unfortunately human beings are not nice and rational and sane. Who knows about the experiment which attempted to find out by confronting people who held different political beliefs with different articles that either supported or disagreed with their pre-existing conclusions? Does anyone know about that? So some researchers would present people from, this is in America, either ends of the political spectrum, Republican or liberal, and they would present them with some articles that they'd just written, newspaper articles, ostensibly either A, saying that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or that there were, or B, that 9/11 was an inside job, whatever it might be. And they would show people an article that either confirmed or disagreed with their current political belief, and they tried to measure, before and after they read their article, whether their political belief had changed, like was it stronger or weaker. And what they found that people who had their opinions confirmed had their opinions more or less the same strength as they were before, and people who read an article that disagreed with their previously held belief actually held onto their beliefs more strongly after reading a piece of evidence that contradicted what they previously thought. So human beings process negative information kind of more strongly than positive information. And actually, so maybe presenting someone with facts that disprove whatever they believe can actually be counterproductive. The best book I've read on this sort of subject is a book by Jonathan Haidt. Anyone ever come across Jonathan Haidt? Yep, fantastic. This is probably the best book I've read in the last 10 years about politics, about society, about religion, about the way people think, and about the way people work in groups. He talks about a lot of the psychology of morality. And he says morality, which is sort of shared values and things that we decide are right and wrong, are one of the things that bind us together, but they also blind us. And so what he's saying by that is that we tend to organize into groups that collaborate well together when we share certain moral beliefs. And those moral beliefs can be like things that everyone pretty much agrees on, like we shouldn't, we should avoid harming people unless, if we can, we should try and have a fair and equal system. But we also have slightly weird moral beliefs about things that are sacred, and things that are disgusting, and things that are, like okay to do to your own group and not to outside groups. So most people accept that it's moral to treat your own family better than it is to treat strangers. But if you're trying to find an actual straight-up rational justification for that, it's hard to find one. So morality binds and blinds, and I think we have that in programming communities as well. Like a programming community organizes in ways that are a little bit like religion or moral-based communities. And so I wonder if we can talk about that in the Python community, for example. Yes, sir. 5 minutes to go. In the Python community, we do hold some things sacred. I was trying to find an example of something that we hold sacred that maybe other people would find a bit crazy. And obviously I can't, because I think that everything we hold sacred is wonderful. But, like list comprehensions, for example. Who loves list comprehensions? Okay, I was trying to explain them to a beginner the other day, and they're actually just for loops backwards, and they're pretty stupid, actually. Maybe. I mean, I'm just suggesting that maybe there's some of our totems that aren't quite as sane as they could be. So we're all irrational. We have arguments. Facts don't persuade us. So basically, all is lost. What can we do? Well, there is a way out. I've learned a few things that I think can help us make us more productive, so I'm going to try and share them with you now. They came from my colleagues. This is my colleague Glenn. Hello, Glenn. Here he is. He's got a caterpillar on his shoulder. And Glenn, when he's having arguments with me, did something that I've not come across before, which is that eventually he would just go, OK, Harry, I'm not arguing anymore. We'll do it your way. I don't care. I'm not talking it about anymore. And I'd be like, right, because you agree with me, right? And he goes, no, I still think you're wrong. It's just that we can do it your way and just get on with something else. And that I found immensely frustrating. I just, no, you have to admit that I'm right. So one of the techniques you can use is when you spot an argument, why don't you just let go of your, even if you're convinced that you're right, you don't even have to concede that the other person is right. You can just say, OK, well, I'm not talking about this anymore. We'll just stop and move on to something else. So that's the Glenn technique. Here's another famous Pythonista. This is Jonathan. Jonathan had a rhetorical technique where when we would get into a discussion, he would say, well, I am a bear of very little brain. Why don't you explain to me a little bit more about your idea so that I understand it better? Because I don't think I understand it yet. Now, Jonathan is not a bear of very little brain. I'm not accusing him, by the way, of being duplicitous here and saying that actually he saw that I was an idiot and he was going to try and ask me a series of leading questions to demonstrate to me that I was wrong. But maybe, does anyone know who that is in the bottom left? Yay! So a Socratic technique might be good. And I think this only really works if, like Jonathan, you are genuinely open to being persuaded of a way that you hadn't already thought of. And so if you actually are prepared to enter into an argument and say, OK, right, well, let me sort of let go of my preconceptions and say, maybe we don't know the right answer. Maybe let me assume that my colleague is also smart and intelligent, and I don't have to prove that I'm right and they're wrong. And maybe we can actually collaboratively talk about the issue and come up with an answer which is not the one that I've already necessarily thought of. So Socratic dialogue. And it's very important while you're doing that to assume competence. So just assume maybe that the people you're talking with are not stupid, that they are smart, that they're as smart as you, that they're maybe smarter than you. When you go away on holiday and come back and your colleagues have made a bunch of decisions, don't automatically go, well, they're idiots. Look, I can think of 5 reasons why this is a bad idea. Why don't you assume that your colleagues have also thought of those 5 reasons, and they've just thought of 10 reasons why the other thing was a good idea, and you haven't thought of them yet. Does anyone know what this is a reference to? Yes! Dog fooding. So one of the final techniques is if rather than having a long argument about something, why don't you just go ahead and build it? If you're trying to get your team to adopt a new practice, why don't you just adopt it yourself and then see how it works for yourself and demonstrate by actually living it what that practice might be. So this might be, rather than having an argument about a decision you're about to make, when you're having an argument about what we should do or the way we should do things or procedures. What about this? This is a dish that's best served cold. Now, I don't want to encourage thinking of these things as revenge, right? But just bide your time. If you find that you're having a discussion, you're pretty sure you're right, just register, I think this is a bad idea for these reasons, or I'm worried about the following things. Let the decision go the way that goes against you, and then find out over the course of time whether you were right. And if you were right, this is a way, especially if you're new to an organization, rather than trying to win every single battle at the moment, just make it clear to everyone what your opinion was, And then over time, if it turns out that you're usually right, people will start to recognize that and they'll start to trust you. And so the other side of assume competence, assume your colleagues are competent, and then over time they will assume that you're competent as well, and your discussions will be more productive. We talked about badges. Another thing you might do to try and get out of unproductive arguments is try and expose yourself to a culture that doesn't value argumentation and being right in quite the same ways. So if you can go outside of the normal programming circle, maybe into, if you're invited to that sort of thing, a group like Django Girls or Transcode, and expose yourself to a slightly different way of thinking and a different way of being and a more diverse culture, maybe you can take on some of those lessons. And I'm not saying that because I'm a man and I love being right all the time, although that is a bit of a character flaw, but that's not the whole of my personality. And actually, maybe being in a different environment where that sort of thing, that sort of behavior isn't rewarded and you don't see it mirrored all around you, might allow you to express different aspects of your personality that you don't ordinarily do. So this is a wonderful thing to do and a wonderful way of expressing yourself. If you can't do it within programming, obviously there are other parts of your life you might be able to do this in. And finally, something I discussed with a couple of people at dinner, thank you very much, Alan and Hamish, consensus decision-making. If you're finding yourself having unproductive arguments at work, you might find that just changing the procedure for how decisions are made can help. And so these guys at dinner were describing the way that they implemented consensus decision-making, which is quite a formal, structured process for making any decision. Anyone that's affected by the decision, which by default is everyone in the company, which is OK for a small company, is involved in that discussion. A proposal is put forward. Everyone in turn is asked whether they can see any problems with that particular proposal. One by one, the problems are then discussed, and we attempt to adjust the proposal to try and address each one of those concerns. And if by the end of that we have a proposal that might achieve consensus, everyone is asked, OK, well, given the proposal, given the concerns that have been expressed, given what we've done to try and mitigate those concerns or amend the proposal, is everyone now happy to go ahead with this? And anybody that is not happy can stop that from going ahead. And that really makes sure that you can get sort of buy-in to the process, but it also makes sure that by making sure that every person's voice is equally valid and that anyone has a right to veto, maybe it takes a little bit of the ego battles or the subtle political battles or the power battles out of those discussions. So that might be a thing to look into if you're finding that in your own organization. And that's my last slide. So that's the story really on arguing. Examine your own reasons for wanting to argue. Try and move beyond a point at which it's a zero-sum game where you must be right and they must be wrong, and get towards a place where you can have a constructive discussion. Look into things like consensus-based decision-making. Be like Glenn and say stop. Be like Jonathan and be a bear of little brain even when you're not. And if you have any questions about this, or you have, I would love to talk about this a little bit more to continue my own self-improvement. Thank you very much all for bearing with me.
Microphone on? Is the microphone on? Oh, yes, it appears to be on. We have time for perhaps one or two very, very quick questions. OK, question at the front.
Hello. You talked about assuming that the other party is competent. What if the other party assumes you're incompetent? I guess you can always stop the argument, but then what? Do you have anything to recommend in that case?
So I think from what I presented, there's two things that occur to me from that. One is the one where you build up trust over time. So if you just say, OK, well, the other person doesn't trust me yet, so why don't I just, obviously I'm not going to convince them today that I'm the smartest person on earth that is, correct and they're wrong. So if I just say some things now and slowly build up a reputation for being helpful and well-informed and occasionally right about things, you might build up that trust over time, is number one. And then number two is just saying, OK, well, rather, if this person is not going to treat me as an equal, why don't I just instead use the Socratic method and just go, well, let's assume that you're the expert and I'm just going to ask you questions. And hopefully, like if I genuinely I'm confused about why you would want to do this thing over here when I think this thing over there is a much better idea, if I just ask you enough questions about why you want to do this, maybe we'll slowly get round to an idea that's closer to mine. If you don't put it in a way that's sort of trying to threaten that person's power, and instead just say, okay, well, look, since you're so smart, maybe you can help explain to me what the right answer is. Something like that.
Wisest are they that know they know nothing.
What did you say?
I'm interested that you didn't give the option of conceding that the other person. Sorry. I'm interested that you didn't give the option of conceding the point and admitting the other person might be right.
Exactly.
Harry, that was magnificent. Thank you very much. Give him a round of applause.